Hey, I'm Pep, and this is a Pep Talk. Now today, we're going to talk about games that you can play during a pandemic. I've been working on this episode for a while, trying to figure out games that I think could work, but it's tough. Now, you might be wondering why I'm making this video. Well, if you are in the current time, which is... gosh, what even is it? June 20-something, 2020. There's currently a global pandemic going on, and admittedly, a lot of places are starting to open up, and a lot of people are allowed to have gatherings of some sort. And I really want to start off this video by making sure that you understand I am in no way endorsing that you should go out and socialize in large gatherings and all that. All I want to do is make sure that if you are going to be doing these kind of things and you want to do it safely, you have some ideas on what kind of games and what ways you can change your games in order to make it so that you can do it safely. For an example, I myself am not really comfortable with doing any form of game night, and we literally have 0 cases in the province I live in. 0. So, yeah, I understand if people are apprehensive, but look at this more as helpful suggestions for when you're ready to go about and having game night, and not me suggesting that you should be having game night, because I'm definitely not. Now, the first thing you're probably thinking is, well, Pep, of course we just can't play board games until we're completely comfortable. Well, that's not necessarily true. There are some obvious ones that you could play, anything like charades. You know, you're up and about, you don't really necessarily have to be near other people, no one has to touch or interact with anything. I also realized that I put some games on here for examples, and they're just kind of stacked on top of each other, so if there's some loud banging, just ignore it. So, my first example of something you shouldn't be playing is something like Monopoly. Now, I know, you're probably not playing Monopoly anyway, but listen. Any game that has similar things like this. Okay, so first of all, you have dice that you all roll. Now, the obvious solution is you get extra dice, but listen, if this game only had one easy solution, I'd be having it in the other pile of things that you can play. But the problem is you have money. You have properties. The only way you could really play this together, and your pieces you touch and put all over the board, yeah, the only way you could really do this is if 4 people all had their own copy of the game and you all just played it nearby and moved each other's pieces along. And I'm not going to suggest games that you have to go to quite that depth in order to play, because that's just too much in my opinion. There are things I can suggest that are a lot easier than that. Another example of a game you probably wouldn't be able to play is something like Jenga, because of course you're all touching the same pieces, a lot of shared germs, shared interactions. Something that you probably can play, however, are things like roll and writes. Most roll and writes tend to have, oftentimes you'll rotate around and different players will roll, but it's not really a big deal to have one person roll the entire time, and everybody else will have sheets. Now the thing is, if you really want to avoid contact and germs and everything, I would suggest everyone printing off your own sheets separately for whatever game they are. Most roll and writes, as far as I've seen, specifically will have printable versions of their sheets online, especially during the pandemic. So go and find those, print those off, and just have one person control whatever the center mechanic is. Now, that's something that is going to be a running theme with this video. In almost all cases, someone, probably whoever owns the game, because they're the person whose germs are already on. I'm interested in germs. I'm not sure that COVID-19 is a germ. I'll probably bounce between germs and infections. If you can just forgive me for that, that would be awesome. But I'll do my best to just try not to. Anyway, yeah, whoever owns the game, whoever's touched the game already, they should probably be the one who are really interacting with it. And that's where something like Splendor would also come in. Now, you might be thinking, well, I have my own tableau in front of me and all that kind of thing, but the person who's running the game can kind of push all the things in front of you. You don't really need to manage your own stuff. You can ask for whatever chips and they can give them to you. Usually when you take chips, you announce which chips you're taking anyway. You're like, oh, I'll take a blue, a white, and a black. So there's absolutely no reason that the person who's running the game can't give them to you, as if they're a dealer at a casino. The only thing you have to do is slightly modify the way you play the game. One of the rules, of course, is that you can pull cards in secretly, or not secretly, like you take a card and then you kind of flip it over and keep it secret. You can either eliminate that completely, because I know a lot of people don't use that anyway, or whenever you take it, you can just leave it over here face up. It doesn't have to be a secret. In fact, now that I'm saying that, I'm not entirely sure it is a secret. But either way, as long as one person is willing to play essentially the dealer role, this is something you can also play pretty much without contact. Now, some other obvious ones, anything that is trivia style. You know, one person, let's say I brought this and I own it, you know, I pull it out and I read the quiz and all that. The only difference between a regular game is that maybe it doesn't get passed around and one person does it the entire time. Ironically, that's actually how we tend to play. One person usually wants to read the questions and that's what they do. Now, I have a big one sitting out here, and this is mostly because if you're thinking of playing something like this, something huge like Twilight Imperium, first of all, if you're worried about contact and making sure that you can't possibly pass COVID-19 on to anyone else, this probably isn't the best idea. But if you're willing to all be interacting on the same board, there's probably some ways you can do it. You know, first of all, washing your hands before and after you play is critical. Not touching your face. As long as you're doing that, you shouldn't be putting anything onto the game that could be passed on to others. But for something like this, generally you just can't. There's a shared deck. There's shared dice. I mean, if you all have a copy of the game, you could technically each bring your own action deck. One person can control the politics deck, but there's a lot of things to be passed around. This is the kind of thing that I think we just can't really be playing right now unless it's with people that, you know, you are already living with. Or if, again, you're just in a situation where things feel very comfortable for you and you're with a bunch of people who feel comfortable. And that's where I want to segue into. An important part of all of this is that everyone feels comfortable. If you are going to a game night, especially if you are any amount of uncomfortable, you want to make sure people aren't touching the things you're touching, etc. I think it's a really good idea to be open about that ahead of time. I went to a very small gathering a few weeks ago, and in my head, I guess I just thought, well, you know, we're going to a gathering while COVID-19 is a thing. So, okay, everyone's going to be bringing their own food. Everyone's going to be, if we're going to be playing a game, we're going to be playing something where we need to stay away from each other, etc. They had no plans of that sort. They all shared their food. They all were completely willing to play games together. And, you know, that's, again, we're somewhere where there's 0 cases, so it's probably not a huge deal. But it kind of was for me, and I was uncomfortable most of the time. And that's the thing, if you're going to be going to some sort of a game night, it's probably a good idea to talk to the other people who are going just to gauge how people are feeling. Because if you show up and don't want to touch anything and don't want to play any games that involve any contact, some of the other people at the table might be frustrated, or vice versa. Everyone might want to be very safe, and there might be one person who shows up and they just are touching everything, they're not thinking about it at all, and then, you know, the other side is very frustrated. So it's a good idea, I think, to ask ahead of time, plan ahead of time to know, you know, are people going to be wearing masks? Are we going to have hand sanitizer nearby for cleaning? You know, we're not going to be eating things at the table. We're not going to be sharing snacks, etc. Like, it's a good idea to get all that onto the table, pun intended. But speaking of on the table, let's just get back to a few more board games. One that I really enjoy is Codenames. Now, you can do this with code names, in my opinion, fairly easily. One person, or maybe two people who happen to be the clue givers, perhaps they are living together anyway, those can be the people who control setting the board up and everything. And you really don't have to touch everything. One of the main rules people usually play by is that once you touch a card, then you've agreed upon it. But if you've played something like Codenames Online, of course you can't physically touch the card, so you just kind of both say you're doing it and maybe nod in unison to say that, yes, this is what we pick. Or you just say final answer, who knows? But the point is, you don't really have to touch things. The only person who has to touch things is whoever is running the game. And this is probably one of the best examples of a game where that can be done. The downside, of course, is you can't really switch the teams up all that much. You can switch the players, but the code giver usually probably needs to be the same person, or at least one of them does, and that person needs to be the person who puts down the tiles and everything. And really, if you think about it, a lot of games can be played that way. You have to get it into your head that if there's something that needs to be touched, it's the owner of the game who should be doing it. And if it's something that has shared deck, hidden information, cards that you play on each other, etc., it might get a little tougher. An example of cards that you play on each other, though, is something like Magic the Gathering. Now, if you're playing Magic the Gathering, or in reality, even other deck builders, well, a lot of times multiple people will own the same deck builder. If you and a friend both own Star Realms, in reality, you can kind of set the cards up on your own side of the table. You'll have to modify the game a little because you'll each have your own buying pool. Maybe instead of a buying pool of 5 between the two of you, you just each have a buying pool of 3. Maybe you even just have the ability to pay money to trash the cards out of their things. At that point, you're making up rules, though, and it's weird, so let's drop off of this one. I still think it could work, but let's jump back to Magic, because everybody's going to be bringing their own deck, and you have your own dice, and you keep track of your own life, and in theory, you don't really need to touch other people's cards, unless you need to read to see what it does, but that's where people can read their card effects out loud. On top of that, sometimes you gain control of other people's stuff, but it's just as easy for them to slide it kind of into the middle to show that you have control rather than giving it over completely to. But yeah, in theory, there's absolutely no reason you couldn't play Magic together, other than the fact that you're sharing some amount of table space. But if we're playing board games together, we've probably already accepted that we're okay with that level of risk. And again, if you're wearing a mask and whatnot, you're probably not putting particles all over the table anyway. There is one last thing I want to get to, but just as kind of an intermission, I did ask on Twitter for some examples of games you could play, and I will admit I don't know some of these games, so I haven't looked into exactly what you would need to do. But some examples that people gave me are Flamme Rouge, or Flamme Rouge. It's probably Flamme Rouge. And I believe each person has their own individual deck in that. There might be something that's shared, but again, you do it together. Race for the Galaxy, Cartographers, Welcome to, which is another essentially roll and write. I guess a flip and write because it's using cards. Legendary Forests, Carcassonne, Tiny Towns, Trophies. If you've never heard of Trophies, that's a really good one to look into, but also a good one for this, because one person, even in the basic normal game, is the person who controls, like, reading the questions and holding the cards, and you technically would give them out to the other players, but there's no reason you have to. You could just keep an actual score on paper of how many letters people have gotten. The one that was in there that was a little iffy, in my opinion, it's Carcassonne, just because there's multiple tiles, so you're technically going to be touching tiles. It's almost like a shared deck in that way. There's maybe ways you could get around that, but again, maybe the shared deck you might feel is okay because you're not actually passing the tiles around. You're picking one up right off the top and then placing it down on the table. So I mean, as long as you're not touching other people's pieces. But there is something to think about when it comes to stuff like that. So I'm glad Carcassonne was on here as an example, because even if you feel like the game itself doesn't have that much germ passing and whatnot in something like Carcassonne, the thing to think about is the cleanup as well. Whenever you put it away, someone has to put it away, probably whoever owns it, and they're going to be touching all those tiles that all those people were touching. And it's a little bit hard to disinfect something like a board game because it's a lot of cardboard and paper, and yeah, short of just dousing all of your cardboard in Lysol, which I really can't see people doing, you know, you're going to have issues with that. So think about the cleanup, think about the person who owns the game and whether or not you would be putting them at risk if you are using shared pieces and whatnot. That's why something like Magic is nice, because you're putting all your stuff back in your own area. So in theory, again, you're never touching anything that isn't yours already. Now, something else to think about is role-playing games, whether it's Starfinder, whether it's Dungeons & Dragons, whether it's Kids on Bikes, I'm just naming the ones that I play, whether it's Shadowrun, whatever it is, most role-playing games have the same core advantage in that everybody tends to, even though you sit around a table, you can sit plenty far apart, you can get comfortable, you can role-play, you can lean back in your chair. The point is, you don't have to interact with a ton of stuff, especially if you're playing with theater of the mind. And if you're trying to play during a pandemic, maybe it's a good idea to start playing with theater of the mind. If you haven't played that way and you don't know what I mean that instead of using a bunch of minis and terrain and all that, the DM will simply describe the battlefield to you and describe how situations are unraveling, and then you say what you would do in the situation. Now, of course, this can be kind of tricky for measuring distance and what, like if you're a spellcaster, but at the same time, it can actually make it easier, because rather than you being 5 feet away from reaching a goblin, if you ask the DM, like, oh, can I make it to that goblin that's running away, he can just say yes or no. And if he says yes, then you can make it. If he says no, then you can't. Like, it's just that easy. And it gives a little more power to the DM, but it also gives a little more freedom to the players, where they're not going to be constrained quite as much by the rules of movement. I feel like I'm advertising Dungeons & Dragons at this point. But the point is, you're each going to have your own separate character sheet that you usually rolled up privately on your own. You're going to have your own set of dice. Nothing's really going to have to touch. Yeah. Now, of course, something else I haven't mentioned is playing games online. But that's not what this is about. Of course, pretty much anything that I've mentioned here, you can do any of that online. And it's a good option. It's a great option even, and I highly suggest it. But this is more about if you are going to be gaming in person, what you can do. And that's basically the video. That's all the things that I really had prepared to talk about. There's going to be tons of examples where you can pull out a game and figure out a way to make it work. My suggestions, my overall suggestions for it are, one, just think about what happens in the game and make sure that it's going to be okay the whole way through. Because sometimes you get halfway through a game and you might realize, oh, like, even though we weren't really sharing stuff, we now have to shuffle everything together and re-deal it back out, which means we're all going to interact with all of our particles. So think ahead of time. Be willing to modify or adapt the game a little bit. Like, let's say you're playing a co-op game, maybe like Pandemic, and normally you don't play with your information revealed. People don't see exactly what's in your hand. Well, if you're going to play and you're going to try to do it where only one person is touching everything, well, they can just deal your cards directly in front of you where everyone can see. It's going to be a little weird, but I mean, at this point, you're probably used to it. You're used to everything being a little weird. So when you go and sit down to play a board game, it might not be too hard to get used to the idea that someone else is touching and dealing everything for you. Anyway, I feel like I had a third thing. Right, the third thing is to just be courteous and thoughtful of others. The whole point of this pandemic, in a lot of ways, hasn't necessarily been to protect yourself. It's been to protect yourself and to protect those who are most vulnerable. So if you are in a situation where you're gaming, think about that. Think about the other people more than you think about yourself. Make sure that the things that you are doing aren't going to put other people at risk and aren't going to make other people worry and be nervous and anxious. Do whatever you can to make everybody comfortable in the situation, because it is a tense situation. I know not everyone is going to find it that way, but for many, it's a very tense situation. Maybe they specifically have somebody at home that is high risk. Maybe they are high risk themselves. Maybe they just work with people who are high risk. Either way, you want to make sure that you're not putting them at risk or anyone they know at risk, and you want to try to do all this as safely as possible. And you also want to have fun. And it's a lot easier to have fun when everyone isn't stressed out and worried about the situation. So anything you can do to alleviate it will probably make everyone feel better. And, you know, hopefully everyone's doing the same for you. And if you do have a game night like this, I hope you have fun. And also don't be afraid to back out. You know, if the time comes that you're supposed to do it and you feel uncomfortable, get out of there. If you're halfway through and someone touches something and you're not feeling okay about it, get out of there. If after you do the entire game night, you decide, you know, I powered through all this and I felt okay for most of it, but I don't think I want to do this again for a while. Get out of there. That's my catchphrase now. Get out of there. Anyway, that has been my pep talk. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some ideas and we got some gears turning about what you can do. Maybe you just disagree with me completely and you think everything's fine. You can just play games however you want at this point. Maybe wherever you're living, you have every reason to feel safe about that. But again, think about others. You know, all the conventions have been canceled, but this would be, in my opinion, good advice if conventions were happening, because you're going to have a lot of people from a lot of different places. I, as an example, like I said, am in somewhere where there's 0 cases. But if I went to Indianapolis for Gen Con, I'm now somewhere where there's been hundreds or thousands of cases. That's scary to me. So I would be very nervous about doing this kind of stuff. I would probably focus more on playing social deduction style games like Werewolf, which is another thing you can do. Don't hand cards out though. Use like a card dealing app or something like that. Anyway, yeah, so hope everyone is doing well. I hope you're feeling safe. I hope you are safe. Yeah, thanks for watching. Kind of petered out at the end there. Lost track of where I was. I feel like I normally say something into these. Live free, game hard. Live as free as is reasonable in a pandemic. Don't use live free as a way to think that you should absolutely be able to go out and get your hair cut. Because, as one might attest to, getting your hair cut isn't the most important thing in the world. Saving lives is. Plus, you know, I actually like it when it gets this long. It's kind of nice. I feel fantastic. And you know, you get the wind blowing in your hair. It's a little hot, admittedly. It is the summer. Yeah, so I don't know when I'm going to get my hair cut. If you're watching this and like my stepmother are curious when my haircut is going to happen, I don't know. My guess would be not anytime soon, but we'll see. Maybe it'll get to just the right length where I just completely don't like it anymore. But for now, I like it. I like the way it bounces. It makes me feel good, and it's not annoying me enough that I feel the need to cut it off yet. So we'll see. We'll see. The fact that there is a pandemic has definitely taken away my desire to go to a hairdresser. You know, I only go to the grocery store as often as necessary. I think I go to the post office twice a month. I actually apologize. There's at least one publisher who sent me a game, and I was a little late doing anything with the game because I didn't go and pick it up from the post office probably for 2 weeks after it got there. I had 2 notices in my box. It was the "you have a package" and then the "claim your package before we throw it out" kind of thing. I don't think they'd actually throw it out. Are you still listening to this? Because I've really been rambling about nothing now. I appreciate it. And yeah, and I appreciate you. Especially if you've been keeping safe and you've been keeping others safe, then I appreciate you a lot. I also forgot to say, please like the video, subscribe, share it, just in case you actually have some people you know that are starting to get into the idea of doing a game night. Maybe share this so that they have some ideas. They probably won't watch this bit at the end. They'll probably just watch like half of it and then be like, oh yeah, I got the gist of what he's saying, which is fair. I'd probably stop watching a video at this point. Although maybe I would just keep watching because I want to find out just how far down the rabbit hole is this going to go. No further, because this is the end. Goodbye. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below, or any questions. Actually, you know what? I wish I said this part much earlier, just in case people didn't listen. But if you have any other suggestions for games that you can play without any contact or with minimized contact, I would love to know them, especially ways to modify games. Tell me how I can play Twilight Imperium 4th edition. Is that upside down? No, it's not. Tell me how I can play this in a way that I don't make contact with anything another player has touched. That would be awesome. I'm very curious to see just how creative this will get. Okay, for the last time, goodbye. Have a good Monday. It is Monday. Although, if you're watching this in the future, it might not be Monday. Or it might be. And you might think, oh, he filmed this today? But it's 2084. How does he still look so young and fresh? I don't know. Okay, I'm leaving for serious this time. I feel bad. People are going to look at the video and they're going to be like, oh, this video is like 30 minutes long. It's like, well, I stopped really talking about like the 18-minute mark. I've just been kind of rambling now. Whew, and it's getting hot in here. I have to close the windows when I'm shooting just so you can't hear cars going by and stuff. But I got to open those windows back up, get some fresh air in here. You know, it's good it's good, you know, even though there's been a pandemic, it's good to get fresh air. If you can get out, get walking, especially, you know, on a semi-private trail, somewhere where there aren't a lot of people, it's great. It's good. You know, a lot of people have been talking about feeling very confined. You know, they shouldn't be leaving the house. Well, if you can find something like that, you know, leaving the house is probably okay. If you're finding somewhere where you're not even near anyone, so you know that's a good way to get away from that feeling. You know, you got a boat, maybe go out for a boat ride. I don't know if that's actually allowed in a lot of places. Who knows? Car ride, same thing. It's probably okay. Just don't pick up any strangers, you know. It's not a good time to hitchhike while there's a pandemic. Okay, I'm sorry. I said I was leaving and I lied. Okay, I'm leaving for sure this time. Goodbye. Thanks for watching. You've all been great, especially you, Jonathan, for sticking all the way to the end. So here's a virtual lollipop. Sucker? That's weird. Does it have to be like spherical to be a lollipop? Well, no, I guess the big ones were lollipops too. So like, are lollipops and suckers just the same thing, or is a lollipop specific? Feel free to mention that in the comments below. You might confuse the heck out of anyone who didn't watch the whole video. I'm probably going to go look it up now anyway, because I'm curious. Okay, goodbye.